very appropriate based on what's been going on. Chris Nance is the Chief Communications Officer with the California Earthquake Authority. And while we all expect our next disaster to have been an earthquake, as it turns out, it was not, it was fire. And so things happen all the time. We can never predict when or where. California Earthquake Authority, Chris and I talked quite a bit before, so I'm not going to give his program for him. But he's been with them for 10 years, right after Northridge. Prior to that, he created the Marketing Value Program that offers CEA policy training and sales support. He's worked in the Schwarzenegger administration. He was a press advanced person in Bush II administration, and has been in public relations, and I know there's a better term for that, but public relations and schmoozing for his career. He moved out here from Michigan, and I think it's very timely and very appropriate, and they're one of those folks who reached out to me early in the year to come out and make a program. So, Chris.
Thank you. How do you? Is there anything that we can do for you? Thanks for coming here today. We are with you all the way. How do you do, Mr. Teacher? How do you do?
Thank you. I'm going to turn him on.
All right. Thank you. And I guess I'm live now.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the nice breakfast. Delicious. It's now entering my bloodstream. Perfect timing. And I guess before we get into what we were planning to talk about here, from all of us at the California Earthquake Authority, our hearts go out to those affected by these fires. I will tell you that for myself personally, I was reading about some of the stories, individual stories in the paper over the weekend, and I had to set it down. Very sad. We're very sorry. So we're going to try and talk about this with appropriate sensitivity. Earthquakes in time, and unfortunately, it's in the aftermath of these fires when we're going to have this conversation. Okay, so we're going to talk about the risk. How many of you have been living in this area for most of your life? Most likely everyone. And so you already, I know at least one person has a lot of earthquake history and information and has written about seismic retrofitting in her past. So I'm sure a lot of you know a lot about this already. Maybe you already know that thousands of faults crisscross California. And throughout the state, most Californians live within 30 miles of an active fault. Here's kind of what that looks like. This is the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey. Most Californians live around the coast. Most of the faults are up and down the coast. And then, of course, in the Sierra as well. I mentioned this is USGS. We work very closely with earth scientists. We base our program on what the earth scientists tell us. And to that end, they're telling us there's a 99% chance of a 6.7 magnitude or larger earthquake within the next 30 years. They use 6.7 because that's the magnitude from the Northridge earthquake, and they talk about 30 years because that's the duration of a typical mortgage. But the bottom line is it can happen any day. Pardon me? I missed a good joke.
You made it. The mortgage.
Oh, the mortgage, yeah. Here in this area, 72% chance of a 6.7 in the next 30 years, and a 51% chance of a 7.0. And the 7.0, it's important to recognize, many of you already know this probably, but to go from a 6.7 to a 7.0, we have a couple of folks here I know who are involved in math. It doesn't seem like a big jump, but for earthquake strength, it is literally exponential. Imagine an earthquake 3 times stronger than Northridge. All right, so here's what here's what the faults look like in your area. Again, many of you already know this You have the high honor of the San Andreas. We spent a lot of time in Southern California too, talking with folks very near the San Andreas. You have the Hayward-Rogers Creek fault as well. The California Earthquake Authority has literally spent millions investing in earth science. It's a prerequisite to how we develop our program for you. And what we've learned from these scientists with their latest iteration is that earthquakes are no longer, or what they've learned, and this has always been the case, but earthquakes are not contained to the fault. The rupture begins on a fault, but it's a part of a fault system. So now they're using this word cascading to describe what happens with a rupture. It begins on a fault, and then within a fault system, you have that cascading effect that triggers ruptures on neighboring faults. We work with science from around the world, and recent earthquakes have further educated scientists, enabling them to come to that conclusion. Scientists work with supercomputers. They work with literally hundreds of thousands of scenarios. We do so as well at the Earthquake Authority. We're close to having run about 400,000 scenarios throughout the state. Here's one that will show you from a supercomputer that's generated out of the Southern California Earthquake Center at USC. And there's a similar scenario like this for the San Andreas. Let's hope this works. Oh, it's moving. So this was accelerated in time just to speed up the presentation. But that's not going to be a good day. And this isn't us here to tell you that this is going to happen. This is what the earth scientists talk about and live with every day in their work, studying what lurks beneath us and the ground we walk on every day. Similar scenario for the southern San Andreas that ruptures from the Salton Sea way up the San Andreas Fault, not all the way up to this part of the state, but similar scenario. Okay, so we were talking earlier about the 1906. And I also talked about the scenarios that we run. We run scenarios a couple of different ways. We work with previous earthquakes and put those in current terms, both in dollars, and of course a lot has changed with development alone, notwithstanding population. So we take that type of shaking, lay it down in current terms. We also run scenarios with potential earthquakes. But for sake of this presentation, we'll talk about the 1906. Everyone here has heard about that. Going back to April 18th, 5:12 a.m. We'll look at a house 10. So if that occurred today, 2 million households from Eureka to Salinas would feel strong shaking. Now in our world, the word strong is significant. That means damage. And what I've learned doing this, working with this topic now for 10 years, California has 300 to 400 earthquakes a month. So we've been very careful to differentiate between just another earthquake and an earthquake that causes damage. Because we have earthquakes all the time. If you haven't signed up for USGS and the signal that you can get for earthquakes around you, maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you don't want to know. And you can set it for the magnitude, and you can set the geographic reach for it. So if you want to know about earthquakes in New Zealand, you can learn about those as well. But they're happening all the time. So we focus on damaging earthquakes. And in this case, similar to a rupture on the, it's a rupture I talked about with that simulation, that's generally what we're talking about here. 250,000 households displaced. Now again, the fires, what a horrific scenario there. And unfortunately, California is just vulnerable to practically every disaster possible. And Los Angeles wins the day for having the highest vulnerability to the most disasters. But it's the case throughout the state. 175 billion is what we would project in damage. And unfortunately, only 15 billion of that is insured. So we refer to this difference as the recovery gap. That's simple math between 15 billion and 160 billion. The difference is money out of your pocket. Now, hopefully, it doesn't happen. And when it does happen, it doesn't affect everybody. But if you are affected, we'll talk about what the potential values are that could be at stake. It will come as a significant consequence. So throughout the state, less than 10% of people have earthquake insurance. Now it varies county by county. In Marin, it's 17%. Sonoma, it's more around the statewide average. Generally, throughout the entire Bay Area, unfortunately, it runs lower than the state average. We see similar numbers throughout the Los Angeles area, for example. But the bottom line is 1,200 homes. Now, not every home is going to be affected with damage, but the consequences, the costs, are real. So is the benefit of earthquake insurance. And I'll tell you straight up here, we're not here to sell you a policy. We deliver about 80 to 90 of these conversations a year now throughout the state. And the reason we do it is because we've learned that there are a lot of reasons for why people don't pay attention to a disaster. It's social science primarily, and there are a lot of perceptions about what earthquake insurance is or is not. We don't care if you're looking at a CEA policy or some other policy, but we do care if you're not paying attention closely enough to know what the decision is, to know what your residential costs will be for recovery, to know how earthquake insurance works, and with that information, knowingly decide whether you want to purchase a policy through CEA or somebody else or not. I talked about some of the reasons why. The social scientists have studied at length all disasters and why people just don't seem to be prepared. And the number one reason is people think it won't happen to them. They think that they'll be watching the news, seeing it, the horrific, unfortunate consequences for other people, but it's not going to happen to me. We hear it, see it all the time, all over the place. People think the government will bail them out. I worked for Bush 41 and with the White House press office, and we spent a lot of time around the country working with people affected by disasters. And unfortunately, the money is not designed to help people rebuild. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Here, government assistance is limited. The Napa earthquake close by, a moderate shake. Remember I talked about strong versus moderate. It was a moderate shake. Initially, not enough damage to prompt the federal government to bring assistance. Political pressure applied, changed that. So the presidential declaration came around, assistance was offered. What do you think the average assistance was for people eligible for grants? What do you think? How much do you think that was?
34,000.
34,000? Well, that's an informed guess. But I'm going to further educate on what the actual dollar was. All right. Any other less informed guesses? Pardon me? 1,000? $2,670. $2,670. Now the informed guess is off by a couple $100. $33,000, 33,800, I think is, and it changes every year. That's the limit. Even if you were eligible for that amount, if your home is rocked off the foundation, that barely keeps you in a hotel for however long it takes to rebuild your house.
That's the amount for the fires. What the homes are going to get, homeowners are going to get for the fire.
Yeah, it's the same whether it's earthquake, wildfire, yeah. So that's, that money, as the federal government, and we're not the government, but what they say is that's for safety and sanitation, things like that. It's not for rebuilding. Now, you can be eligible potentially for a loan, and that's limited to $200,000. And it's a loan, so you have to pay it back on top of your mortgage. You know, a few years ago, I was in a Uber car out to the airport in LA, and people always ask, well, what do you do? And I say earthquakes. And they say, oh, boy, that rings near and dear to my heart. I'm still paying off my loan from Northridge damage. So we hear these anecdotal stories all over the place all the time. Another myth that we run into all the time, and this is common with flood too, people think their home insurance policy covers earthquake damage. It does not. So we're very, very, very assertive in reminding people that you need to have a separate policy.
That's right.
Did I forget something here? No? All right. So finally, I want to talk about where we are with earthquake insurance today compared to what you may remember if you last looked at it, say, 20 years ago. We hear that all the time, too. So rates are down, coverages are broader. It's no longer a product designed by the legislature, which is what we were offering initially. We talked about that a little bit earlier. So I want to help you learn a little bit about the CEA. We're a not-for-profit organization. We're not the government. We've been in business now for 20 years. So here's how it works generally. Some of you may remember this. Back in '84, a law was created that said if you are a company like State Farm, for example, you sell home insurance, you have to offer earthquake. And at that time, all the companies said, fine. Then along came Northridge. And companies realized that they had not adequately determined the exposure they could be vulnerable to with shake damage. Nearly busted their banks. So they said, we're not going to cover earthquake anymore. And the state came around and said, but if you offer home insurance, you have to offer earthquake. For those of you, you may remember. So then those companies said, fine, we're not going to offer home insurance. Well, that was a bit of a problem, for obvious reasons. So the legislature moved in and created us. I already talked about this. Here's some of the damage. So, you know, these companies were not prepared to pay. Well, they had the money, but they had no realistic estimate for what that potential damage could cost. So the CEA was created. Now all of these companies choose to offer the CEA policy. They have to pay into our capital base to join the CEA. And then they can offer our policy and contain their exposure to earthquake damage to the penny. So I can't speak for those companies, but I would say that's a pretty good business move. You saw that the risk indeed is real. They see that too. So if you have home insurance with one of these companies, if you don't have earthquake insurance, we recommend you at least talk about it with your agent. This would be a CEA policy, but they can sell you any policy, and we don't care. If you're not with one of these companies, then they will not have a CEA policy to offer. All right, so I mentioned that we're not under the government, but we do have the governor, insurance commissioner, and treasurer as board members. They're voting board members, and then we have the assembly speaker and the Senate rules chair as non-voting members. we don't have anything to do with the state budget. We'll talk about finances in a second. But that's very important. That money's there to pay claims. And currently we have just under 1 million policyholders throughout the state. And our mission is first and most importantly, educate. That's why we're here. Mitigate. We've created some residential mitigation programs. Has anybody heard about that? We offer $3,000 financial incentives to help people retrofit their homes. If you're in an older home. And then insurance, of course. All right, so here's how our finances work. And I will tell you that there's no other entity like ours on the planet. We receive calls from around the world quite frequently asking for advice how to financially manage this kind of exposure. We hear from cities like the city of New York, for example, curious, after Sandy, subways were flooded. They were curious to learn, they wanted to learn from us how we work with covering that kind of exposure. So when there's a massive earthquake, remember 12% of homes damaged have earthquake insurance. We are required by law to be actuarially sound, which means we have to cover our claims. Technically what that means is for rating agencies, we have to show them that we can cover any number of events that might happen in 1 year within a 400-year period of time. Very conservative. So we have $15.2 billion in claim paying capacity. We have about $6 billion in cash. Legislators can't touch it. We spend close to $300 million a year on reinsurance. This exposure is spread throughout the world. There's not any one country that can financially cover that, frankly. And then the companies that buy into us play a role in what we call an industry assessment layer. So if we have a big earthquake, for Loma Prieta, if it reoccurred today, cash. Northridge, nearly cash. Still have the claim paying capacity, we tap into our reinsurance. Similarly with 1906, reoccurring today, no problem. If it's bigger than that, then we go to the participating insurance companies and say, sorry about this, but here's the deal, you're on the hook financially as well. Less than a 0.5% chance that we won't be able to cover claims. We're quite proud of that. All right, so lastly, we want to talk about how the policy works. But not without first reminding you, inflation up 51% since we've been around. That's of consequence. But most importantly, reconstruction costs are up 168%. How many of you have been in your homes for 20 years? A lot. The reconstruction cost is very important for you to have awareness for how it works. First of all, your insurance company, your home insurance company, has a formulaic approach to determine what that value is. And that's, in case they have to replace the entire house, that's the coverage that you're buying. We match that with the CEA policy. When you derive a premium for earthquake insurance, whether it's with us or someone else, it's not the appraised value, it's the reconstruction value. We see all the time people going into the premium calculator and saying, well, my house is worth $800,000. Well, that's going to throw off your premium if the cost to rebuild is really only $400,000. So very important. After you hear this conversation, we'll show you how to work with the premium calculator. It's pretty darn simple. But not without first saying that while those numbers are going up, we've brought rates down. And the way we do that is by reducing expenses. And we reduce our reinsurance expenses through offering catastrophe bonds. I don't need to get into that. Your eyes will roll in the back of your heads, but the savings that we derive from reducing our expenses, we pass on to you in the form of reduced premium. All right, so The column on your left is a policy the legislature created. Pretty crummy. And if you haven't looked for 20 years, if you didn't buy it then, we don't blame you. Things have changed a lot. So now you choose what your premium is. Personal property up to $200,000. The deductible from 5 to 25%. The deductible, so far as premium is concerned, is your friend. That is your ability to dial up or down your premium based on how much coverage you want to buy. Loss of use. Imagine being out of your house for any period of time with only $1,500. That's going to put you in a hotel, probably in a location where you're not going to feel safe, and probably only for a few days. And then the mitigation discount, there was no such thing. So moving forward, we also offer $100 or $1,500. What that does is, if your house is rocked off the foundation, your roof is opened, it's a wintertime event, you've got cash immediately to throw a tarp over the house. Windows are broken, you've got glass in the carpet, you've got cash to help you through that. The deductible, very important here. We hear this all the time. It doesn't work like a car payment, like a car claim. Surely none of you have had a car crash here. But for those you know who have, when you go to the body shop, you have to cut a check to receive your car. That's not how it works for us. Rather, it's where the deductible kicks in is where the claim payment starts. So in this area, you have an average cost to rebuild of just under $500,000. Let's say your house is rocked off the foundation. You have a 5% deductible. It's possible you could have 105% damage to your house. We'll write you a check for $500,000. If it's less, that deductible is based on the cost to rebuild. So if you have $300,000 in damage, you have 5% of $500,000 is the cost to rebuild, subtracted from your deductible, and that's how much we pay you. Does that make sense? We have insurance agents oftentimes who need some help understanding how that works. Loss of use, up to $100,000, no deductible. And then finally, whoops, with the older houses, how many of you are in a house built before 1960? And you step up into the house? Do you have a crawl space under the house? Okay, a couple of things there. First of all, check with an engineer and make sure the house is braced, meaning inside that crawl space, that crippled wall has been sheared with plywood properly. And then secondly, that the house is bolted to the foundation. Those two things were not a part of building codes before 1979, really. Now, if you have a CEA policy, you can be eligible for up to a 20% discount if you properly retrofit your house. Highly recommend that. If you're in an older house, that's why premium is higher for older houses. All right, so we'll wrap up here. So, here's basically how it works. You click on the premium calculator, you get started. I talked about just under $500,000. So if you're at 15%, premium is $722 a year. Does that seem like a lot? $1,200 for the lowest deductible, $500 for the highest deductible, and then you have all these other features. The last 2 years since we've changed this policy sales have been through the roof, and we believe it's because people now choose. 7 times the annual average last year, and we're on pace again to do that this year. So call your agent, have the conversation, make the decision, and then whether you decide to buy it or not, at least you've had the conversation, at least you're educated on what your risk is and how the policy works. That's it. Thank you.
One more thing before you go.
Chris?
Yes, oh, pardon me.
We do have a raffle prize. So, mixed in here with all the money are some raffle tickets, so she's so kind. Bring them up here.
All right.
Draw the winning ticket.
I take a commission on this, by the way. Do I have to read the,
Get the deductible.
what if I can't read this without my glasses? 668-7997?
What? Yes.
By the way, I forgot to mention, if you want this information, it's here for you.
I do.
We get an IOU from Linton for the door prize.
And then you can order something.
Yeah, we know what you like. Okay.
Pick the winning one.
That's the one.
But
Wait, another class.
And,
Wine Charlene. In the speaker or wine glass.
okay. Joke of the day. Linda Sinkay.
Tell me.
18.
Yeah, the other A left.
Oh, he gets an F.
So, a guy named Joe goes to jail for robbing a bank. And he's in jail for the first night, and the lights go out, and somebody down the cell block shouts out, 47! And the whole place erupts with laughter. He says, that's strange. And then the next thing you know, a cellmate across the way yells out, 77! And the place just roars with laughter again. So he asks his bunkmate Charlie, what's this all about? What's so funny? Oh, we've been here so long, we hear the same jokes every time, we just call them out by number. So he says, okay, I'll give it a try. And he shouts out, 14! Nobody laughs. He's like, what the heck? And Charlie says to Joe, some people just don't know how to tell a joke.
Joe.
Happy trails to you.